Music theory with Excel. Mirror inverse intervals. Get ready and some coffee because you ain't never seen rockin' unless you excel at rockin', and we excel at excelling at rockin' because we use Microsoft Excel. We are in Excel. If you don't have access to this workbook, that's okay because we basically built this from a blank worksheet but started in a prior presentation. So if you want to build this entire worksheet from a blank sheet, you could begin back there or just practice building the current part of the table that we're working on. If you do have access to this workbook though, 4 tabs down below: fretboard, example, practice, blank. The fretboard tab having a simulated fretboard that we will refer back to. The example tab having the finished product, in essence the answer key. The practice tab has pre-formatted cells, so you could practice the practice problem with less Excel formatting. But if you don't have any of that, that's okay because we'll be working in the blank tab where we started from scratch, but this time working from the blank part of the worksheet, still practicing both our Excel formatting skills as well as music theory skills at the same time. Let's go to the fretboard tab to get an idea of what we will be doing, noting that we're looking at measurement terminology. Problem with measurement terminology, it's not set up in an optimal way, and therefore the terms used can be confusing and could often pull us out of the optimal way to be visualizing the fretboard in order to unlock or be able to navigate the entire fretboard as easy as possible. That being to visualize it as a map of the territory with 7 destination locations, what we're calling the continents on the world of our fretboard. The other 5 locations that are not destination locations, similar to the oceans, things that we go through to get to the continent locations. We imagine ourselves up above in space. Our head is up here looking down on the fretboard where we have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. The fretboard, like the world, rotating around. We're going to give it 12 degrees of rotation, labeling those with the notes, typically working in the key of C, but noting that everything is relatively the same if we were to move the whole thing up to C sharp or to D, for example. And that means that once I know the degree that I'm looking at, I don't want to name the whole system by the note names. It's most optimal to name them by the Nashville number system, 1 through 7, which is basically the modes, right? The absolute mode system: Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Dorian, Aeolian, and so on and so forth. Problem with that, however, is the naming constructions that we currently use often pull us out of that system. In part, this time we're looking at those naming constructions with regards to distances, remembering that if I go a half step, I can call that a half step. If I go a whole step, 2 half steps, I can call that a whole step. But I can also call the half step a 1 note away minor second. I can call the whole step a 2 note away major second. If I go 4 notes up, I don't have half step or whole step options. I could say I went up 4 notes, but most people will name that distance by saying it's a major third. And I just have to know it's a 4 note away major third. And the fact that I say it's a third means that I've made this the 1, even if it's not. Even if I went from here up 4, if I went here up 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, then it would still use that same terminology. I don't want to make that the 1. That's going to be one problem. Now, also we have this issue of directionality that becomes a problem. So remember that if I'm going up, if I'm going from this node 1 and I want to go up 11 half steps, note half steps, which would be, where would I get to? I would get to, let's count it out this way. It would be 5, let's say 10, and then 11, because there's 5 notes between the strings. I'm going up pitch-wise down towards the floor on the guitar, 5, 10, 11. So I can go that way, but I can also go back 1, directionality going back 1. We don't have a term to say it's going -1. Now remember, when we visualize the clock face, when we visualize our numbering system, we can visualize it kind of like a clock going around the block, which it only basically gives us the names going clockwise around the clock, but we could go counterclockwise around the clock directionally. If you think about it linearly, like a notes number line going up infinitely. It could also go backwards infinitely. It repeats, but we have infinite forwards and backwards. So our current naming system gets confusing because it doesn't really tell us a terminology for going backwards. So last time we talked about the inverse. So the inverse, and this is kind of getting into the weeds, but note, it shouldn't be this complicated. It's this complicated because the naming convention is a little bit wonky and doesn't really take into consideration directionality and is trying to use this concept of scale degrees, which makes everything off by 1 because we're not using proper distance terminology. So let me show you what I mean. If we're going from here to here, that's what we call a 7-note away, typically called a perfect fifth. How do I know it's 7 notes away? Because there's 5 notes between here and then 6, 7. So that would be 7 notes away from the perspective of this point. But what if I measured from the perspective of this point? So it would still be 7 notes away in reverse. So it would be 1, 2, and then plus 5, 7 notes away. But we don't say negative 7 notes away. What we typically do is say we're going to take the inverse distance, which is going to be 12 minus 7, which would be a 5-note away perfect fourth. So you can see that's a little bit wonky. So you can see the inverse here. What is it doing? If I'm measuring from this point to this point, then I'm gonna measure the normal distance going clockwise around the clock. And then the inverse would be like measuring from this point back to this point, right? If I'm measuring from this point back, although it's not perfect because really this point is going backwards, right? Really, it should be going up pitch-wise to use the same terminology. That's why the inverse is a little bit weird. So from a practical standpoint, if you're on, say, the guitar and you're trying to figure things out, or any type of instrument, when you're going up pitch-wise, which would be down towards the floor on the strings of the guitar or towards the right on the guitar, then the terminology makes sense. So if I'm going up a 5-note away, it would be down below here, 5 notes between the string. That would make sense, 5-note away, perfect fourth. But if I'm going lower on the guitar to the left or up on the guitar, lower in pitch, then I have to do this inverse thing to use the same terminology, meaning I'd be going back 1, 2, plus 5, 7, and I can't really use a negative 7 term, so I have to use the inverse, which would be 12 minus 7, which would give us a 5-note away perfect fourth. All right, what I'd like to do is use directionality. So I'm going to introduce it a couple different ways, trying to shoehorn it into the current system and then use our interval system where this makes a lot more sense, right? But so if you're in the current system and you're saying, hey, look, I want to go back 1. So if I went forward 11, that'd be 5, 10, 11. I would get to from the Ionian node to the Locrian node. If I go back 1, then I would also get to the Locrian node. So I can go directionally, pitchwise, forwards 11 or backwards 1. I'd like to have a term saying something like negative 1. Now, if I say negative 1, the problem from a scale degree standpoint is if this is the first scale degree, it would be a negative second scale degree. Most people don't use that term, right? Most people don't use a term, a negative second. Some people I've heard actually use that because, again, they want to give directionality. So what I would propose doing is saying, if you're using the normal naming convention, you can use the intervals almost like it's a modal range system, meaning it means I can either go directionally clockwise or counterclockwise around the clock. So if I went backwards, I would say it's a negative 1 major 7. Major 7 usually means you're going forward 11 notes. So if someone says they're playing a major 7, then usually you assume it's going forward 11 notes. But really you can think, well, a major 7 either means, from a modal range standpoint, it means I'm going from an I in modal range, an Ionian to a Locrian if I'm starting on the Ionian, right? And so that means that it's going to be either forward 11 steps or backwards 1 step. Okay, so that's one thing I want to touch in on. And then when we get to, if you want to use the terminologies that are per mode, then it makes a lot more sense, because then the directionality makes sense. Because if I say I'm going forward an 11 note away, I6 modal half steps, then the inverse of that, I can take 12 minus 11 would be, I can go backwards -1 I, and then it would be the first modal half step backwards. So if you were to use a symmetrical system that used proper naming, this would be easy to do. But because we're using a scale degree system, it's more difficult. So that's what we're going to dive into. It's a little bit in the weeds here, but don't worry, we've got a hatchet. We're going to hatch it through the weeds, no problem. All right, so if I go to the example tab, remember our analogy here. So if we're on the fretboard, I just took the map and I put it on what I call position number 1, where we have North America, ocean, Europe, Asia, ocean, South America, ocean, Africa, Australia, ocean, Antarctica, ocean, back to North America. There's 7 continent locations that keep repeating across the fretboard, 5 ocean locations. It's actually easier to visualize than a map, because in a map, I can go through the middle of the map to go from place to place. We're really dealing with a system where you can only go around the block. Now, I could go around the block clockwise, or I can go around the block counterclockwise. The current system is set up to be in scale degrees, but really that's not the proper way to measure. If I'm going from position 1 to position 4, I shouldn't say it's the 4th scale degree. I should say either I'm going up 1, 2, 3 continents, which would be the equivalent of what I'm calling a 3 modal half steps, or I'm going up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 continents and oceans, which I'm calling note half steps. But I can also go backwards, right? I can go this way to get to the same location. So if I'm going to this 4, I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, -4 nodal half steps, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now note, do you have a terminology for intervals that have a negative distance in them? We don't. That's a problem, right? So even if I'm going backwards, which means usually I'm going down pitch-wise, then I don't have a negative term. I basically have to deal with as though I'm naming it going forwards or clockwise around. So that isn't optimal. We should have a negative term, right? Because there is such a thing as going negative. You're going to have to visualize, if you're playing a guitar or a piano or any instrument, you will be going backwards sometimes, and you have to at least use the terminology that you currently have to understand what that means. How can I name going backwards? A lot of times guitarists just abandon it altogether because the naming convention is weird, so they just start memorizing shapes and totally abandon the idea of distance. But that's not useful to do. You want to have an idea of it. So there's a couple different ways that we can think of it. Let's go to the blank tab and let's think it through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this one right here orange. This is our middle point now. And we've only been going, I'm going to go up top and make this orange. Now we've only been going up forward from there. So we said that you can go 1 through 11 distances because there's 12 notes, and we named them each distance interval that we can have. We named with these intervals, and we also named them as they relate to each of the scales, which I think is a better naming convention, because again, this naming convention kind of shoehorns you into something that is based on the major scale, which is an arbitrary, somewhat arbitrary thing. You'd like to know it from the point you're on, but let's put that aside for now. Then I'm going to select all of these items all the way over, and I'm going to insert. So I'm going to go from here down to here. I'm going to go back on over, and I could pull those down. I like to right click, and then I want to insert, and then I want to pull these down. So make sure to shift them down, not to the right, and then boom. And then, so now it's going to try to format them like funny. So I don't want it formatted like that. What I'd like to do is grab this formatting. I'm going to grab this formatting and format paint it. And then I'll pull that all the way across up top because it tried to give us the header formatting. That's not right. That's not right. So there we have it. So now we can go directionality upwise or clockwise around the clock, but we also have the idea that we can go backwards around the clock. Now, I'm going to try to make the headers something that they stay constant even when I maneuver around. So what I'm going to do is let's actually go here and go to the freeze frames, which is in the view tab. And I'm going to go frames and freeze the panes. So if I freeze it right there, notice I can go down, the headers stay the same. And if I go to the right, I can still see this information on the left, which might be necessary for us to be pulling from and viewing. All right, so that's the idea. So directionally, notice we can now go -1. What if I go backwards or counterclockwise? And then I'm going to go -2, and we'll say -2, and then I'm going to select those two and copy them up, and Excel should see the pattern taking us down to -9. I'd need 2 more rows. So I'm going to go all the way over and right click and insert and shift down. Okay. And so there we have it. So now I'm going to grab these two and pull it up. So we should go up to -11. All right. So now we can either go up or clockwise or down negatively, typically pitchwise, counterclockwise. All right. So so now we're going to say we have the half steps, and then I'm going to call this then the mirror inverse. So I'm going to add another column, selecting column K, right click and insert. And I'm going to call this, I'm going to make this a little wider. This is going to be the mirror inverse. Inverse. Okay. Well, let's just call it the mirror distance for now. I'm going to make this centered. Let's make this centered. Okay, and then we've got the interval. So that means, so now I added these columns. I didn't need them. I'm going to delete these top bits now. What happened here? Now I've added too many. Right click and delete those ones. Shifting up. Okay. All right. So there we have it. All right. So that's going to be the idea. So now if I'm going down then I note that if I'm measuring from one point to another point and I go one step forward, then if I measure from the other point backwards, then it would be 11 back. It would be 11. But notice that this 11 is measuring as though we're always thinking about going clockwise around the clock. So in other words, if I look at the fretboard, the inverse, if I go from here to here, then that would be a 7 node away distance. But if I'm measuring from this point here back to here, it's a -7 distance, but we usually measure it as though this is going forward. So we measure it like this is going from here to here, which would be 5. That's how the current inverse kind of system is working. But I'd like to add then a negative distance. So it's going to be the same, but I'm going to make this one negative. So I'm going to say this will be equal to 1 minus 12, which would be a -11. So it looks similar, but it's a little different. You see, so we're going to say this is going to be equal 2 minus 12. So I get to the same numbers, but this is going to be a negative directionality as opposed to measuring from the other point, right? Which would give us kind of the inverse name. This would be I'm measuring going forward, and then if I measure from the other point, I would have the inverse, although I would have to take the distance as though I went clockwise around the clock. Here I'm saying we're actually going in a negative distance. All right, let's clean this up to make it a little bit easier to see. I'm going to hide columns M and N, intervals, and the abbreviation. Right click and hide. And then our point of focus is going to be on this column as we go counterclockwise around the circle, and on this column, which we'll talk about more later. So I'm going to make those yellow. All right. So what if I go a -1 distance? What would I call that from a normal scale degree system? Well, you could say, well, I'm going to put this first because I have to make a negative, or else it'll make it funny. It's going to be a -1, and then we could call that a major second scale degree, because if you were on this C, and if that was the Ionian from a scale degree standpoint, if that was the 1 and I went backwards, then you could say, well, that would be the second in the negative direction. And the second in the negative direction would get you to the Locrian, Ionian to the Locrian if you're starting from the Ionian. But although I've seen a few people use that terminology, most people I've seen don't. So what I would recommend then is to think about the terminology by adding the negative half step, which most people don't add. I'm going to say it's a -1 note, right? And then I'm going to use the same term for the range, for the distance, which is a major 7. So in other words, the major 7 is a distance term that usually means we're going to go clockwise or up in pitch 11 notes, right? So you have the major 7 is going to be down here, which is up 11 notes. But you can also go backwards -1. So in other words, if you want to use these same terms, which you can't really get away from, I would think of it more like it's going either direction. A major 7 means that most of the time you're going forward 11, but it could also mean that you're going backwards 1. And that's nice because it gives you the same flavor. If I go backwards 1, although I'm going back pitch-wise, it still gives me the flavor of a major 7. So I can say it's a -1 major 7. Or I'm going to say it's an 11-note major 7 going forward, or a -1 major 7 going backwards. If someone just says major 7, you assume they're going forward 11 steps, but you could, in theory, go backwards 1 step, right? That's the idea I'd want in my mind. Now, note that it would be better or easier if we used a terminology that didn't have scale degrees, like if we said it was an II term. If the modal range going backwards 1, what would happen? I would go from IN. It would be an IN modal range. And so the modal range would be going from it would be from a distance perspective, it would be going from a 1 to 7. Now, oh, wait a sec. Undo. It would be going, let's say, 1 to 7. Now, when I say a modal range of an IN, Ionian to Locrian, or a 1-7 modal range, usually we're going up from 1 to 7. But the range, like this term I'm saying here, I could imagine going backwards. It either means I'm going up on the clock from 1 to 7, or I'm going backwards back to 7, back by 1 to get to 7. And so what would be the distance term if we were to name it this way? We would say it's going to be a -1 I first modal half step backwards. And then I did it again. So let's say it's going to be this first -1 I first modal half step backwards, which would be the second scale degree. But again, we don't use -2nd scale degrees. So we use the 7. So, right? But the reason this makes more sense is because it's easy to see if I went in the other direction, meaning if I went 1 step back, then 12 minus 1 would mean I'd go 11 step forward. And if I went 1 modal step back, notice I'm not going to put 2 negatives. So -1 would be a -1 I -1. The negative's going all the way through. So I'm going -1 modal half step back. 7 minus 1 would get us 6. So see, it's easy to see this way directionality. I'm going clockwise or I'm going counterclockwise. If I go counterclockwise, I would be going -1 half steps from the Ionian node, which would be -1 modal half steps. If I went the other way, it would be 12 minus 1 or 11 steps forward, and 7 minus 1, 6 modal half steps forward. That would be the idea. So again, I think this is a much more logical terminology, but obviously this is the one that we're going to see, most often. And I would just try to get your mind or wrap your mind around the idea that a major 7 could be going up 11, which is equivalent to going back 1, and at least get that idea in your mind. Let's from the Ionian's perspective, just do the ones that are in the key first. So if I was on the Ionian here and I went back 1, let's say we went back 2. So now I'm going to an IA modal range, but I'm going backwards, right? So now if I went from the I back to the A, how many steps would that be? 1, 2, 3. -3 steps backwards. That would be right here. So from this perspective, which I think makes more sense, right? I would say that's going to be an IA modal range. if I was going to name that with a modal range, it's going from the Ionian, the 1, to the 6, which means I could go 1 forward to the 6, or I can go backwards from the 1 minus, which would take me to the 7, and then the 6, meaning going 2 backwards, 2 modal half steps backwards. So then we're going to say, all right, so then that's going to be, what would I call that? I'm going to put this first so that Excel doesn't do something funny. -3 half steps backwards from the Ionian node, which would be 2 modal half steps backwards. So if I was on this, if I was on the Ionian and I went down 3, 1, 2, 3, it gets me to the Aeolian. Okay, but if I use the normal naming convention, what would I say? I'd have to say, well, I'm going -3, and that's going to be in the key, so you would think it would be a major unless it's a perfect. And then again, I would like to say it's a major. If this was the first, then it would be negative. If this was the first, negative, it would be first, second, third, the -3rd. But again, nobody really uses that. I have to use the inverse term. How would I get it? Well, 12 minus 3 would say that we're on 12 minus 3 would be 9. And then I have to know that the 9 is a major 6, right? So I could say it's a 6. So again, I would start to try to memorize that the major 6 means that I go clockwise 9 steps, but it could also mean that I go counterclockwise down in pitch 3 steps. So that's how I'd start to try to understand that term from just a distance perspective. All right, next one. Let's say we're going from the I up. So I'm going I up to the next one after the A. 1, 2, 3. So it's the -3rd modal half step going counterclockwise around the clock. So if I started on the I here, how many steps would that be? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So -5 steps. So -5 would be here. So I would call that from a modal range. We're going from the I to the X, right? We're going from the I to the X, and that's going to be then, I have to hit this first, 1 down to the 5. So we're going 1 forwards or backwards. Now we're thinking backwards, 1 back to 7, 6, 5. And then we're going to say, okay, that's going to be, what would I call that? I have to hit this first. It would be a -5 note away from the Ionian node, which would be the -3rd. I'm not going to put another negative, but I'm just going to say that negative follows through, -3rd modal half step, which would be the -4th scale degree if we saw scale degrees going negative, but we don't typically think of scale degrees going negative. In other words, you would think this would be then, so this is going to be a -5, and you would think it would be a major or perfect. It's tough to know if you should use major or perfect. -4th, but no, we're going to say if it's a -5, the inverse of that would be 12 minus 5, which would get us to 7, which would be a perfect 5th, right? So it's be a perfect 5th. So I'm going to say it's a -5 perfect 5th. In other words, the perfect 5th means I can either go clockwise 7 or I can go counterclockwise by 5 from a distance perspective. All right, next one. What if I go to the next one up from I after the X going counterclockwise? So if I'm on the I, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I'm going from the Ionian to the Lydian, but I'm going counterclockwise. What's the distance backwards or counterclockwise from the Ionian to Lydian? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps backwards. So I would call that still a modal range going from I to Y, which could go clockwise or counterclockwise, meaning it's going from, I'm going to say the 1 to the it's going from the 1 to the 4, meaning I could go forward or I could go backwards to get to the 4. Right now we're thinking about going backwards. So I would call that then, it's going to be a -7 from the Ionian node, and it's going to be the 4th modal half step, which would get us to the 5th scale degree if there was such a thing as a negative scale degree, but we don't usually use negative scale degrees. right? So under the normal terminology, what would it be? I would say, wait a sec, this needs to be, I put this in the wrong area. Let's copy that and put it here and delete this. It should be on the 7. Okay, so if it was a scale degree, I'd have to say this first. It would be a negative 7, and then again, you would think it would be like a major 5th scale degree or a perfect negative 5th scale degree, but no, we have to use the positive scale degree. So I have to take the inverse and say, well, okay, 12 minus 7 would be 5, so it's equivalent to going 5 forward, which is a perfect 4th. So when I say perfect 4th, then I could be saying that I'm going 5 forward for the perfect 4th, but you can also think of it distance-wise, that you can go 7, negative 7 counterclockwise. All right, next one. So now we're going to go from the I up above the Y. So if I'm on the I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 modal half steps up gets me to the Phrygian. All right, what's the distance from I to Phrygian, Ionian to Phrygian? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to be on the 8 here. So we're going to say, then I would call that a modal range of an IP, Ionian to Phrygian, which would be 1, 3. Now again, the 1, 3, I could go forward, 1, 2, 3, or 1 back, 1, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. And so right now we're thinking about going backwards, which would be then, I have to hit this first, a negative 8 distance from the Ionian node, which would be a 5th modal half step, which would be the 6th scale degree if we had scale degrees. Now again, notice the reason this is so much more logical is because, again, if it's going the other way is easy, because I can say, well, okay, 12 minus 8, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is 4, and 7 minus 5 would be 2. So you would think that going forward, it'd be a 4-note away I2, right? It'd be a 4-note away I2. So you could see how it would be easy to figure out going clockwise and counterclockwise how many steps it would take to get to the same location if you used not scale degrees and you basically measured from the node that you're on. But we don't do that. The current term doesn't do that. So you would think that this would have to be something like a negative 8, and then you would think it would be like a major 6th scale degree. But really, we have to think of the inverse. So 12 minus 8, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 would be a 4-note away distance, which is a major 3rd, right? So I have to say so the major 3rd, as we can see here, could be a 4-note up distance, but you can also think as a major 3rd could be 8 notes back. So again, most people don't really think about it that way, but that's, if you're going to use these terms, that's kind of how I would think about it, right? Because you have to think about it from a distance standpoint. This would be a lot more logical, but obviously you can't really communicate with people using this term, although I think it would be easier to do internally because then again, it doesn't mess you up. It's cleaner. All right, let's say that we're going to go up from I past the P. So if I'm on the Ionian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I can go 6 modal half steps up. What's the distance to go from an I to a D if I go up? So if I start on the Ionian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's a negative 10 distance. Here's the negative 10. So I would call that still a modal range of an ID, Ionian Dorian, which would be a 1, 2 from a Nashville number system, which I would think you can go 1 forward, but the range also means you can go backwards, clockwise or counterclockwise. So we're going backwards right now, which would be a 10-note away from the Ionian node, a 6th modal half step. Again, negative 6, negative 10-note away from the Ionian node, which would be a negative 6 modal half step, which would be a negative 7 scale degree if there was such a thing as negative scale degrees. So, but we don't have negative scale degrees. So you would think over here, it would be a 10-note away. It would be a negative 10-note away. And you would think it would be something like a major 7th scale degree. But we don't have negative 7 scale degrees. So we're going to call it, if it was 12 minus 10, it would be 2. So, and I know a distance of 2 is a major 2nd. So in other words, a major second usually means we go 2 forward. So we have a 2 forward major second, but the major second, if I don't list the notes distance, could also mean that we're going 10 notes backwards, okay? So now let's add the ones in the middle, the ones that are not in key. So if I'm going from the I right after the N, that'll land me in the ocean. So if I'm on the I right here and I go right after the N, it lands me in the ocean. So I go 2 up, it lands me in the ocean. So that means I'm going to go to an I, I'm going to say an IA. Well, now we have this directionality problem. So I could say it's going to be an IN negative or an IA positive, because now we introduced this directionality thing again. So let's go IN negative, and then I'm going to say that's going to be I'm still going to call it then. This one still works because we use numbers, so we don't have to come up with 2 different terms. So I'm going to call this then a range of a 1 to a 6.5, which could be 7, or in between 7 minus a half, or above the 6 plus a half, right? So then we're going to say, all right, so that's going to be a negative, it's going to be a negative, let's say do this first, negative 2 node away from the Ionian node, and it's going to be a 2.5. It's going to be a negative 1.5 going distance-wise this way. So it went negative up. That negative still applies to the 1. So I could say it's a negative 2I negative 1.5, but I'm going to assume the negative goes all the way through. All right, so if I was over here, then what would we call this? We would call this a negative 2. And then again, you would think it's not in the scale. It would be a minor. So now it's in the minor. So you'd think it would be a negative 2 minor second scale degree. But no, we have to take the inverse. 12 minus 2 is going to be 10. So we usually call that a minor 7. A minor 7. Hold on. So I did that again. I have to do this first. Negative 2 minor 7. So in other words, if I look at the minor 7, it usually means I'm going 10 forward. So that means, but it can also mean I'm going 2 directionality backwards. All right, let's do the next one. So we're going 4 notes back. So if I'm on the Ionian, I go back 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, lands me in the ocean right after the A. So I'm going to call that a modal range of an IA negative, meaning I'm going right after the A, landing in the ocean, not getting to the X. So from a modal range standpoint, I'm going to call that a 1-5.5, meaning from this minus a half or this plus a half, right? And then I'm going to say this is going to be a negative, and we're going to say it is a 4 note away I distance of 2.5, meaning negative 2.5, because the negative is applying to both the 4 and the 2. So that's what's landing us in the ocean. What would I think about that over here? We're going to say this is a negative 4, and then it's going to be a minor because it lands us in the ocean. It's not in the major mode. And then, but I have to figure out the inverse. So 12 minus 4 would be 8, and that would be a minor 6. So in other words, the minor 6 over here is 8 notes away distance-wise. It could also be then 4 notes backwards. Okay, so then let's do the one after the IX. So if I go after the IX, and I was right here on the Ionian, and I go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right after the X, lands me in the ocean. So 10 notes, 6, negative 6 lands me in the ocean. So I'm going to call that an IX negative right after the X, and that's going to take me from distance 1 to 4.5, because we're going to be in between these two. And then I'm going to say distance-wise, that will be a negative 6 from the Ionian node, and it's going to be a 3.5, meaning negative 3.5, because the negative follows through as we're going up in the negative direction. So on this side, we would call that then a negative 6 node away, And then we have to think that 12 minus 6 is the diminished. So it'd be a diminished fifth, typically, a flat 5. All right, and so then we're gonna go, and so then we're gonna go up to that's the weird one. So we're gonna go up to the next one and say, well, what if I go right after the P? If I go 9 notes away up from the Ionian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lands me in the ocean. So what's that gonna be? It's gonna be an IP negative right after the P going upwards. We're gonna call that then a 1 to a 2.5 modal range, and I'm going to call that then a negative 9 I, and then the negative still applies. I'm not going to put another negative 5.5 in the negative direction. So over here we would call that then a negative 9. The inverse would be 12 minus 9, which would be 3. So it would be a minor third. 3 note away would be a minor third, minor third. So when I see minor third, I could say it's 3 notes clockwise, but it's also could be 9 notes counterclockwise. And then finally, if I go a distance of 11 backwards from the Ionian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, lands me in the ocean right after the Dorian. So we're going to say that's going to go to an ID negative, let's say. All right, and then that's going to be then, I'm going to call that then number-wise, it's going to go from 1 to the 1.5, and then, wait a sec, number-wise, yeah, and then it's going to be negative 11 note distance from the I node, which would be a negative, but I'm not going to put another negative, 6.5 in the negative direction because that negative carries forward. Over here, we're going to call that a negative 11 note away. 12 minus 11 would be 1, and we just have to know that 1 distance would be a minor second. So an 11 note away, a 1 note away, a minor second could be a 1 note away minor second, but also it could be a negative 11 note away minor second. We're using the same term to go forwards and backwards that way. All right, so now I'm going to add these same terms down here so I can see it, side by side as well. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to add another column here after the O. So I'm going to select column P, right click and insert, and then I'm going to call this the mirror interval, the mirror interval, right? Instead of the inverse interval. Okay, and I'm gonna make this blue. Let's make this top bit blue for now. I'll make this blue for now. And then down here, I want to see the mirror interval in the same column, meaning the major second could be going forward, or we said that it could also be going, the minor second could also be going backwards. So how am I going to do this? I'm just going to say this equals this one up top, right? It equals that, and I can just copy that down. So now we can see it in the same column. So in other words, now I'm saying an 11 note distance forward could also be a 1 note distance forward could be an 11 note distance backwards. We're going to call that a minor second. The minor second could therefore mean, and I would add the notes when you talk about it, right? I would say it's a 1 note away minor second, or it's a negative 11 note away minor second. So you can say it's a negative minor second or a positive minor second, but most people don't add the number of notes. I would add them, particularly if you're on the guitar, because it's going to be a lot easier to know what these intervals actually mean if you list out the distance term and give directionality to them. So and all you have to do is you have to memorize the distance in notes to be able to do that, which is useful because you want to know the distance in notes anyways. Now we could do the same thing up here as well. If I go -1, what's going to be the inverse distance? Well, it's going to be equal to 12. I'm going to say plus this negative 11. So that's going to be the mirror inverse. I'm going to copy this up then, just to complete the table. And then I can also do it, so that's going to be the mirror inverse. And then I'm going to pull this over here and say the mirror inverse. I can say this one is also the 11, right? So I can say, okay, this is going to be then equivalent to, let's say, equals the 11 note away major 7, just to fill out the table. 11 note away major 7, boom. So now we could say, okay, if I'm going -1, I can call it a -1 major 7, or an 11 note going forward major 7, just to complete the table here. And then we could say, well, let's stop it there for now. I'm giving myself, we've gone enough in the weeds, I think, for now. So that's going to be the general idea. So again, directionality, I think, is useful. Now we're going to go through later in following presentations and do the same directionality thing using these terms, which I think makes more sense. But we can also, as we do that, refer back to this terminology to see kind of why it's a little wonky and how you can, hopefully that'll give us a better idea to use these terms appropriately, so that, again, we see them as a directionality term that'll make it easy, so we use them properly. We can list them out properly and use them in the most efficient way. Although, again, I think if we use the terminology like this as well, or we're able to convert back and forth from this terminology, it makes a lot more sense, right? This is the way that you would think, if it was built from scratch, you would do at this point in time. But again, this is one of those ones where you're saying, well, maybe that's a step too far. I can't do that because I need to use the normal terms, or I need to go back and forth. Even if that's the case, I highly recommend thinking through this concept, because that will show how we can use these terms most effectively, to see what the pros and cons of these terms are, or why they confuse people sometimes. All right, and one of those things, of course, is directionality. Directionality is a problem. The scale degree is a problem. The fact that everything's based on the major scale and all of the other modes are not factored in. We're not measuring from a particular nodal distance, depending on the node that we're on, right? That's kind of a problem. Those things will be more revealed as we think about it in a system that I think would most likely be the way people might generate it if an engineer built it today with all the information currently available.